Hello, government students. Today we're going to be doing notes 5.3 on interest groups. Your essential question: what is the role of interest groups in the United States government? So interest groups are private organizations whose members share certain views and they work to shape public policy. Now, public policy is all the goals that the government sets up and the various courses of action it uses to attempt to realize these goals. So, these interest groups are sometimes called pressure groups because they're groups of people that can put pressure on our elected officials to adopt their views into law. Interest groups are not the same thing as a political party. They differ in nominations, their focus, and what their interests are. So, in regards to nominations, we nominate people to become our representatives, right? We're going through an election right now. Political parties are responsible for the nominating process. So, political parties, we have the Democrats, we have the Republicans, they hold primary elections, they have debates, they focus on really ramping up elections to get those people nominated and elected into office. Interest groups, on the other hand, they're more focused on influencing those nominations. They want to influence the parties to nominate people that will suit their needs. Their primary focus differs as well. Political parties are interested in winning those elections. So they nominate candidates and then they want to win the election. Right now, the Democrats nominated Joe Biden. They want Joe Biden to win the election. The Republicans nominated Donald Trump and they want Donald Trump to win the election. But interest groups are more interested in influencing the policies that are created by the government. So instead of really focusing on the candidates, they're focused on the policies that those candidates can make. The scope of interest also differs. Political parties are concerned with a wide variety of affairs. Of course, they can't just be focused on one thing, whereas interest groups tend to focus on a single issue that matters to their members. The functions of interest groups vary. So, interest groups help to raise awareness of public affairs, things that concerned people at large. So, it concerns the entire United States or their specific group of people that they're representing. Interest groups represent the people who share the same attitudes rather than people who are sharing geography. So, interest groups can be like the NRA is an example, the National Rifle Association. This is a group that's focused on Second Amendment rights, and that's across the United States, not necessarily just a California organization or a Texas organization, but they represent people who want to protect Second Amendment rights for the entire nation. Interest groups provide specialized information to the government and to legislators. Interest groups such as teachers' unions, they can provide information about education in our classroom, and they can provide that information to our government. You all can remember a couple years ago, our elected officials in Washington, D.C. were debating whether we should arm teachers in the classroom, whether we should give teachers guns to prevent school shootings from happening. Now, this may have seemed like a good idea to our elected representatives who don't work in classrooms every day, but they got information, specialized information from the teachers' unions, the interest groups that represent teachers, to say, teachers don't really want to do that. Interest groups can also be vehicles for political participation. They can encourage people to get out and vote. They can keep tabs on various public agencies and officials, and they compete with one another for the time of the elected officials. Some interest groups have been criticized for having an influence that is much larger than the proportion of their size or their importance. So, the NRA, for example, has been criticized a lot, the National Rifle Association. It's been criticized because they have such a large size of organization, they have such a huge amount of money, and they can donate to so many candidates. So, they have a big influence on gun legislation and gun policy in the United States. It can be difficult to tell how many people are actually being served by an interest group. They can share how many people are in their group, but many interest groups would argue that they represent a larger group than just the people who are involved in their organization. Groups do not always represent the view of the people they claim to speak for, and in rare cases throughout history, different interest groups have used negative tactics such as bribery or threats to accomplish their goals. Reasons for interest groups. Interest groups have been founded for many different reasons because of economic interests, business interests, labor, agriculture, professional interests, many different reasons why we have interest groups. Some are based on a geographic area. So, if you're looking at a specific area, like in California, we have the California Teachers Association. So, that could be an interest group. That's a union that represents all teachers in the state of California that teach in public schools. So it's a geography located interest group. Some are based on a cause or an idea. So, like the Sierra Club is based on a cause of environmentalism. Some promote the welfare of certain groups, such as retired citizens. The AARP represents all retired people in the United States. Some are run by religious organizations that want to make sure that religious people have their rights. Some of these interest groups are also labor unions. They do the same thing, but we have had a decline in labor unions in the United States in recent years. Public interest groups seek to institute certain public policies that they believe will interest all or almost all of the people in the country, whether or not they belong to that group. So these are some examples here, like I mentioned before, the AARP. This is for retired people in the United States. So this represents all older Americans. So they believe that what they're fighting for is going to benefit all or most people in the United States because eventually we all will become elderly. The ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union. We learned a little bit about that in Unit 4 when we were learning about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her fights for civil rights through the Supreme Court. The ACLU has fought for civil rights through the United States throughout history. They've continued to fight through the court system to ensure that all Americans have their basic freedoms and civil rights. So they would argue that they represent all the people in the country. The National Organization for Women, yes, they are called the National Organization for Women, so obviously their focus is for women, but they argue that policies that treat the genders equally, all genders equally, benefit all Americans across the nation. Interest groups can reach out to the public to influence public opinion. They can supply information, they can build a positive image for their group, and they can promote a particular public policy. This equality symbol here is from the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, and they promote LGBTQ rights across the United States and hope to influence public policy for things like marriage equality, adoption, trans rights, all those kinds of rights for LGBTQ people. So they're trying to promote those policies state by state as well as on a national basis. Interest groups also use propaganda, just like political parties. So I know you learned about propaganda in your English class a while ago, but in case you don't remember, propaganda is a technique of persuasion aimed at influencing individuals or groups' behavior. Its goal is to create a specific belief, which may be true or may be false, but propaganda really disregards a lot of information that doesn't support its conclusion. It's not necessarily true or objective, it presents one side of an issue. So often it relies on name calling, using inflammatory labels, not very positive spins for much of propaganda. These are some propaganda pieces that were mailed out when we were fighting over the issue of marriage equality in the United States. Remember, before 2015, we did not have marriage equality for LGBTQ couples across the United States. Some states had implemented it, but many states still had not. So they were going state by state and letting voters vote on marriage equality and decide whether they wanted it in their state or not. So when they were fighting for same-sex marriage or marriage equality in the state of Maryland, they sent out propaganda that looked like this. Here on the left, some Maryland families are under attack, had like a child's doll crying for same-sex marriage. So seems outdated and maybe a little ridiculous now, but definitely something that was used in very recent times to fight against marriage equality. And here is a political cartoon that regards the same issue that came out during the same time, about the same time, when we were fighting for marriage equality in the United States. So on the left, 1960, there was a fight against interracial marriage. Actually, interracial marriage between two different races, two different people of two different races, that wasn't legalized until Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court case in 1973. So, yeah, a long time ago. I'm sorry, 1963. 1963. 1973 was Roe versus Wade. But so that fight that was being fought in 1960 was very similar to the fight that was being fought in the early 2000s in the United States regarding same sex marriage. So political action committees can also influence elections. They can raise a lot of money. They've been used more and more recently. Political action committees raise money and then they distribute it to candidates who will help further their specific goals. And they do this by lobbying. So, lobbying is an activity in which a group pressures legislators and influences the legislative process. So, lobbyists, they are brought to government agencies like the executive branch, the court systems, they're brought to Congress. They go and they meet with representatives and they try to influence the legislative process. Nearly all important organized interest groups have lobbyists that are maintained in Washington, D.C. They live in D.C., they go to the Capitol all the time, and they discuss the issues with the members of Congress. Lobbyists use several techniques to get their job done. They'll send articles, they'll send reports to the office holders to make sure they're getting the information that they want. They will go and testify before legislative committees. They will bring about grassroots campaigns. They'll get people to start writing letters or emails, making phone calls that live in the district of that representative. They will rate candidates and publicize the ratings. So, like the NRA, like we were talking about earlier, the National Rifle Association, they rate every single candidate. They give them like a letter grade, just like you all get letter grades in school. They give them a letter grade on what they believe that that representative does for Second Amendment rights in the United States. So they can get like an A through F grade. They also make campaign contributions, so they raise money and they give them to the candidates that they like, that are pushing their legislation, and that will help them get their laws created. And that's the end of your notes for today, so don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.